Hi, it's time for Hebrews chapter 9. Glad you're joining us. I'm so excited for these last few chapters. I feel like the writer has been building up to some points, and we're getting to the good stuff right now. So, chapter 9, the sanctuary is a sign of better sacrifice. I'm not entirely certain what his phrase, the sanctuary is a sign, but I did decide to leave it because half the chapter is about the Old Testament sanctuary, the tabernacle. So I left it. And in the discussion questions, I'd like us to talk about what you think he meant by that. So the writer of Hebrews has now established that Christ is our high priest. He is our high priest, not like the high priests of the Old Testament. If he had been, he would have broken the old law. Instead, God has made a new covenant. Under this new covenant, Jesus is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. He is not after the Levitical high priest order. So this is a better covenant under better promises. Okay. Building on these things, the writer continues in chapter 9. In the first part of the chapter, the writer again takes us back to the Old Testament. This time it is a brief review of the duties of the high priest. First, the tabernacle was prepared. Now, in the Old Testament, there are whole books written on how the tabernacle was to be set, how it was to be ordered, how things were placed inside. And this writer in Hebrews just sums it up in a few verses. All these things were very specific in the Old Testament. The writer here is taking only half a chapter to explain these things. So the tabernacle had to be laid out very specifically. On the inside, in the first part, or in the first room, often called the holy place, the writer here says there was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread. Behind the second veil is called the most holy place, or as this writer puts it, as it is translated in my New King James Version, the holiest of all. In this holiest of all place was the golden censer and the ark of the covenant. And inside the ark was the golden pot that contained some manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, and this was proof that the priesthood should be with Aaron and his descendants, as well as the tablets of the covenant. These were all inside the Ark of the Covenant. So the writer says, of these things we cannot now speak in detail. The actual physical items from the tabernacle, or later the temple, were lost many years before this was written. As the temple had been destroyed and rebuilt at some time. I didn't look up the history of that. You can do that, certainly. And so the writer of Hebrews is writing this probably, most likely, before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70 or thereabouts. So he says we can't now speak in detail of these original things, the original tabernacle, the original temple that David built, or that Solomon built, David wanted to build. While we do have word descriptions in the Bible, we don't have pictures or any of these items to look upon now. In verse 7, the writer begins to discuss the actions of the priest. These, again, were very specific in the Old Testament, and the writer is summing them up for us now. He was to go in alone once a year, but not without blood. Not without blood from a sacrifice. He was to offer the sacrifice for himself and for the people's sin. These were for sins committed in ignorance. Verse 8 tells us that because it was behind a veil, the way into the holiest of all wasn't clearly seen. The priest, as the writer tells us in verses 8 and 9, had to follow ceremony of washing, eating and drinking properly, and various ordinances in order to perform these sacrifices. But these things were all in vain. Now, they were to be done, and by their obedience, it showed a sign of their faithfulness to God. But as far as taking away their sins, it couldn't fully take them away. Verse 8 says, these sacrifices, quote, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience. Wow. So they had to do all these things, but it really wasn't going to ultimately help their souls and to purify themselves, spiritually speaking. In contrast, verse 11 tells us about Christ. But Christ. These two simple words are so important. But Christ came as high priest of the good things to come. Just think of all the good things that Christ brought. So much better than before. And he serves in a tabernacle not made with hands. Here, buildings are imperfect, aren't they? Recently, James was putting wallpaper in a couple of our bathrooms, and he was complaining about the way the corners came together. The wallpaper wouldn't fit in the corner. If it fit here, it wouldn't fit at the top. So it's very difficult for us on earth to build things perfect. It's impossible in this world, but Jesus serves in a tabernacle not of this world. It is not made with human hands, and it is perfect. So now we have this wonderful high priest and this wonderful building that he works in. Now, what about his work? Verse 12 says, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. Eternal redemption. I love those words. The writer of Hebrews says that the blood of bulls and goats would purify the flesh, but how much better his blood? He offered himself without spot to God, and this cleanses our consciences. The writer says, quote, cleanses our conscience from dead works to the living God. How much greater is it? Is it so much greater that we should turn from these dead works that mean nothing to the living God? These sacrifices that the priests make are dead. They are in vain. Now we have something better, and we should turn to that. Recall that he's talking to Jewish Christians, people who used to participate in these sacrifices. They would bring them to the temple or the tabernacle, but the writer of Hebrews is making a point. They're not good enough. They never were, and they never will be. So let's turn to the living, eternal God, the one who made a one-time sacrifice that will eternally redeem us. One time, one and done. So because of this, the writer says in verse 15, he is the mediator of a new covenant by means of death, his death, for the redemption of the transgression under the first covenant, that those who were called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. He continues to say that where there's a testament or will, there must be a death of the testator. We understand this today. When a person makes a will, the will doesn't go into effect until the person dies. There's no power in a will while the person lives. The first covenant or will also had blood to dedicate it. When Moses spoke the law to the people, he'd taken the blood of calves of goats with water, scarlet wool, and hyssop, and he sprinkled the book and the people with it. Blood sealed that covenant as well, since verse 22 tells us, without shedding of blood, there is no remission. So it was necessary that these physical copies be purified with them, but the heavenly things themselves are purified with better sacrifices than these. Again, the writer asserts that Christ has not gone into this earthly tabernacle, but into the one made without hands, into heaven itself, so that he, Jesus, can appear in the presence of God himself for us. Not with inferior sacrifices, but his one-time sacrifice. He won't have to suffer every year. He suffered once for all time. He has put away sin so that there doesn't need to be any more bloodshed. Not my blood, not your blood, and no more bulls and goats to die for sin. Those that wait for his return, wait for him to return, not to take away sin, because he's already done that. But this time he will come for salvation. What an amazing thought, and it's a great way to close out this chapter. I couldn't find the word better in this chapter, so I challenge you to find it. Certainly it is in there in the idea of these things that are all better. Let's review our key phrases. We've got something better for the whole book. Chapter 1, no one better than the Son, a better person. Chapter 2, don't neglect what you knew, better knowledge. Chapter 3, faithfulness is the key, better than Moses. Chapter 4, the rest that he swore, better rest. Chapter 5, our priest is forever alive, a better priesthood. Chapter 6, it might be impossible to fix, a better hope. Chapter 7, priest of God in heaven, better priest. Chapter 8, God's covenant gets an update, better covenant. Chapter 9, the sanctuary is a sign, better sacrifice. All right, we have some discussion questions, so be sure to look for those either in the Facebook group or in the email that you'll be receiving later today. So thank you for joining us. Don't forget to hit subscribe and also further mark something so you'll get notifications when we upload videos. Thanks. Bye.